Afternoon, given your time again to the Academy, and we're in for a special treat this afternoon. My name is Chris Coates. I'm actually the new director here at the Academy of Art and Museum. And I know we're going to be in for an inspiring talk by a fellow alum, Ed Fella, graphic designer, artist, and educator. As you know, however, in addition to hearing Ed talk about his work this afternoon, we're actually here to recognize Ed with one of the highest honors of the Academy, which is the 2014 Cranbrook Academy of Art Distinguished Alumni Award. But we're going to tease you all and wait until after his talk so we can have a celebration after the remarks. But now I'd really like to take the time to introduce Elliot Earls, who is head of our 2D program here, to introduce Ed Fella. So, Elliot, thanks.
Okay. Needless to say, I'm extremely excited to have Ed here to celebrate his contribution to the design field. I'm not going to read Ed's bio or give a standard CV-based introduction. I feel that that's unnecessary when you're among family and when you're home. So I'm going to try to personalize things a little bit. In 1990, when I was working in New York City as a young designer, I became aware of a mysterious and confusing design school named Cranbrook Academy of Art. Even mentioning its name in the firm that I was working in would elicit scorn. It would elicit derision, but primarily it would elicit a general sense of confusion. At that time, I was considering grad school and looking for more than the commercial, what the commercial world could offer. Needless to say, Cranbrook, because of this reaction, piqued my interest. But upon researching the Academy through Emigre magazine and a book called Cranbrook Design: The New Discourse, I became acutely aware of specifically Ed's work and his importance. At that time, Ed seemed to represent what I thought was the intellectual center of the Academy itself. I determined that his work was so odd, so different, and so completely the opposite of absolutely everything that I had been taught that I would say it was because of Ed that I decided to try to follow a similar educational trajectory, and I believe that I followed Ed to Cranbrook. But it wasn't until I was fortunate enough to meet Ed the first year of my grad school that the full force of Ed's brilliance really became evident to me. Put as simply as possible, Ed Fella has had a profound effect on graphic design in America. I think it's primarily through the power of his work. However, I do believe that this is quickly followed only by his skill as a teacher. Ed has had a major impact, unequivocally, a major impact on influencing a generation of designers. And there is no way that I could possibly put into words, and I mean this with every fiber of my being, how important something as simple as spending 3 days in 1991, maybe it was 1992, but whatever, how important spending 3 days was with Ed to my personal development. I consider myself among the fortunate many who have been influenced by his work and teaching. From that moment, I have always considered Ed Fella the greatest graphic designer I've ever met. And when we talk about a taxonomy, or my personal taxonomy of graphic designers, he's unequivocally among history's greatest. I'm even more fortunate to consider myself a friend of Ed's. And the last thing that I would say is that Ed's work has been a major component in establishing the critical importance of Cranbrook to the history of graphic design, and that's something that I think that all of us in this room can be very proud of and can be very grateful for. So join me in welcoming Ed Fella.
Okay. Also, do I really need that spotlight on me? I can't see. Can you? Yeah. Can you turn it off or down or something? Anyway, sorry. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the award. Thank you for everything. And I'll start off with a little anecdote. Two masons were working side by side, and they were asked what they were doing, and one said, "I'm laying bricks," and the other one said, "I'm building a cathedral." And that's kind of a metaphor for design and my design work, which was both functional and experimental and somewhat pretentious, as you can see, cathedral building. I'm an exit level designer in the sense that I had two careers, one 30-year career as a commercial artist or graphic designer or professional, and then another 25-year career as a educator. So I have a lot of history. So this lecture is about that history, my history, history in general, history of design, making history, being history, and of course it's also about commercial art, which is now called graphic design, and art, naturally, and the American Vernacular, which I'm especially interested in, and especially interested in being a designer concerned with and interested in the American Vernacular. So it was 1993, Elliot, that you were here, and I came, and Kathy McCoy, I think it was my first lecture that I actually did so I did a flyer. I'd been doing these flyers. And by the way, these flyers are done in offset printing. It was something called quickie printing. It was a little offset press, and the size was 11 by 17. So there was a front and a back, and it was just bond paper. It was actually business printing. It was before all the Kinkos. So if you needed something printed quickly, they could print you up a couple hundred copies while you waited. So I used this kind of printing them for these flyers. And so anyway, I made a flyer for and they were after the fact. That's another thing. I would never, since I was exit level, which means I turned everything over to the next generation and I wouldn't compete with them anymore in terms of any actual projects. I always did a flyer for a lecture or an exhibition, but I would bring it after the lecture, after the exhibition began, instead of before. And this was the flyer. And Kathy McCoy said, show your Cranbrook work, but also show some of that stuff you used to do when you were a commercial artist that you called shiny shoe. And, in other words, my professional career. So I tried to make a flyer, had my face in it. I was going to have a little two eyes and then my name and had a text with typefaces I did at Cranbrook. That was going to be the beard and all that. But what happened was it didn't work. It was a failure. I tried, all the shiny shoe thing, tried to make a letter form and, on and on. And I made notes about it, and in the end, it just didn't happen. So it's a failure. The flyer was a failure. And I put all the information in with my notes on the bottom of it. So, what's shiny shoe? It was those little 4-part highlights that you see on the shoe. And anyway, I'll get to that in a minute. So I'll go back to the beginning. I'm a Detroiter. I was born here in 1938. My parents were European immigrants. My father was an auto worker. I took art classes as a kid in the Diego Rivera Court at the DIA, and I think that's amazing that, I would go down there on Saturday as a preteen, and, we'd set up our little easels in the court, and, it's like having art classes in the Sistine Chapel, in a sense. And also I went to Cass Technical High School, which was an arts high school, a trade school, as it was called at the time, a technical high school. And it was in downtown Detroit, and it was when Detroit, all the buildings in Detroit were filled. And I had a terrific education there in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And it was kind of the Bauhaus ideology of art and design being either functional or pure, and the idea that an artist was a photographer, a typographer, a painter. And so, we learned how to make designs. You had to make a little collage and then render it, because everything was done by hand, of course, so you had to learn how to draw. And we had art classes, obviously, where we did printmaking. This is the print. And I was already a rebellious high school kid, so I made fun of sad-eyed or big-eyed painting, which was all the rage in the 50s. So there's the big-eyed person, but he's in jail. Something to be sad about. In fact, I see there's a movie coming out on the big-eye painting phenomenon of the 50s, which should be really exciting. Anyway, when I graduated from high school, I became a commercial artist. So I got a job in a Detroit art studio, commercial art studio, and there I am, starting off as a designer, illustrator in the art business, as it was called. And everything in those days was done by hand, tools of the trade. All the years that I worked, and I still work with the same tools. And of course, they're all gone now. If I was to do this today, I would have one computer and the cup of coffee. Everything else would be obsolete. And so all the work I'm going to show you is all pre-computer. Anyway, I started out in the late 50s and early 60s with a lot of pharmaceutical work, Park Davis. This was during the period of what was called American modernism. And when we had classes at Cass Tech, the big hero designers were the Eameses and the Saul Bass and Paul Rand and Lester Beale and all those people. So that was kind of the design that we were kind of inundated with as the ideal. Oops. No, this doesn't, I see. Okay, so there's the inside of that. Oops, there's the inside of that. That was the cover and the inside, and it opened up and so on and so forth. And also, in the late 50s, I did illustrations or cartoons where I would do a little ad and do the cartoons and the lettering, design the ad. And I did worked in various styles. There was a rip-up of Robert Weaver, and the other one is that English cartoonist. His name escapes me, Ronald Searle. And I tried to develop my own style. That was a little Ford ad for used cars. And the other thing was what was called a sample, where you would try out styles and see if you could interest art directors in them. And that was another 1959 style of kind of abstract expressionist cartoons. I don't think I ever sold anything in that style. And I had a style sheet, as illustrators had in those days, with this kind of loose, quick style. So I eventually developed a style of illustration. And cars, of course. It was Detroit, so we did lots of cars. So I did cars from tight mechanical cars to very loose, cartoony cars. And it was really quite learn the craft of drawing these mechanical cars really was a good apprenticeship in getting your skills, your hand skills. And in those days, everything was prescribed and very tight. And so, I did this kind of stuff. And it was done with ellipse guides, all this mechanical stuff. And I continued using these ellipse guides for the rest of my career. So all this lettering that you'll see is basically also done with these ellipse guides. And the other thing is, while I was learning to be a really slick and highly skilled commercial artist, I was also interested in the other side of it, the ineptness of it, or the getting it wrong. And this is an example of a kind of inept mechanical illustration. And I actually entered this into an illustration show in 1964, and it won a bronze medal. And the reason was, of course, is the jurors got the joke, because they came to Detroit to jury this wonderful mechanical stuff, and then they see this little inept thing. And since then, years ago, Rick Pointer said that I was an expert at the inept. And actually, that's exactly what it is. I was an expert at all sorts of styles, so it was easy to undo a style. And I did a lot of that. And I did a little record cover in early 60s, and it was ragtime. So, I used that kind of turn of the century lettering, but it's done wrong. It's not authentic. It kind of looks like it, but it's irregular, and it has little bits in it that wouldn't have been part of that era, and so on and so forth. So it was the same idea of kind of taking history and repeating it, but repeating it differently. And the thing that in the late 50s, the complete no-no was what's now called Art Deco. At the time, it wasn't called Art Deco, it was called neo-modern, or shiny shoe, or at least I called it shiny shoe. The illustration part of it was, again, with those four-part highlights. It was kind of like John Hell Jr., and there was a certain kind of typography in it. And I really liked it because it was wrong. Those huge circle O's next to those tight letters. And again, it was a way of doing it and redoing it. But at the time, also, it's not historicism. I wasn't trying to do it authentically. And that's why it says neo-modern. So the idea was doing it, but doing it in a new way, or a different way, or in a skewed way, actually, because I thought it was funny, even though everyone said, "Oh, kid, you can't do that stuff. You'll never get any work." But of course, by the 60s and 70s, Art Deco became a huge style during that period of so-called pushpin era, when all these styles came back. So here's a shiny shoe illustration. There's another one. So I did I even had a shiny shoe style sheet. And eventually I came up with a kind of mechanical cartooning style, I called it, and used it for lots of different jobs and projects. And again, you can see the kind of mechanicalness of it and the type of work that we'd have done in the Detroit business. And of course, I also love the typography of Art Deco. And here's one from the early 60s where Art Deco was put together with op art. Again, a hybrid that was not really very authentic. There's another example of that. I, of course, had a style sheet for Art Deco lettering, Sweets catalog. And in 1969, I did the entire Chevy Vision 70, all the dealer promotion that was done in Art Deco. And then, Art Deco kind of went out of fashion. Oh, by the way, yes, I did this little thing for Cranbrook during the early 70s, during the oil crises. Kathy McCoy was teaching here, and she said, "Oh, we need a little sticker, inch by inch, inch square, to put on all the lights." And she said, "Do it in that kind of Art Deco style." So I did, and they printed it, and it was on all the light switches for years in the 70s to remind people to turn the lights off. So there's Art Deco at Cranbrook. And then, of course, my real career for 30 years was, automotive catalogs, and I did tons of hospital stuff in the Swiss modernist style with Helvetica and columns and systems design, logos, symbols, and what was called design illustration, where you would design, and this was for Hudson's, J.L. Hudson's contract furniture division, where you did the illustration, the type, and the idea and everything. because most of the work was uh, uh, was directed by art directors who'd say, I need this, I need that, and so you would just follow the brief. In this case, with this kind of design illustration, you got to come up with the idea and the illustration and the design of it. So, 30 years of We Hack Like Mad, which is an ad I did for one of the studios that I worked at in the 60s. Caused a lot of fuss because I used that word hack. And by the way, that's a type repro, something else that's long gone. And on the bottom is a bumper sticker that I did in the early 80s. And I started doing stuff for arts organizations, and they had a show that dealt with automobiles. And so I proposed this bumper sticker, and they said, oh, we can't print that. If we say that, we'll lose our funding. So I sent the bumper sticker to the DIA, and the curator of modern art sent me back a bumper sticker kit where you could make it by hand. So I made the bumper sticker by hand, 25 copies, and we did use it after all, and they never did lose their funding. But on the other hand, it was what I felt about the difference between art and design, again, in a kind of jokey, extreme way. On the one hand, this idea of hacking, and the other idea that this pretentiousness of art is an ethnocentric cultural construct that you don't gotta have, because the DIA had this huge campaign that said you gotta have art, miles and miles of art. But it says down there, choose to visit Detroit Institute of the Arts anyway. But the point of this is the kind of dichotomy between design and art, which will come up again and again. So there was no way to do experimental work, for clients, because that's pretty prescribed work, as I just showed you. So to do experimental work, especially at that time, this is from the early 70s, you would have to cut type out of magazines and paste it down and reconfigure it and make a photostat. That was about the best you could do. You couldn't get anything printed because it would cost way too much money, and typesetting cost a fortune. So experimental work was all just kind of one-of-a-kind things done this way. So the only other way you could do it was with promotion. So in 1969, I discovered this new kind of printing, the printing I just mentioned, that the flyers are printed in, the 11 by 17 quickie printing, or BIP printing as it was called. And that moon poster, I wanted to celebrate the moon landing, which was a big deal in 1969, for the only time it actually was. And so I that was my first flyer. I realized that for $50 I could have it printed. Again, the style of it at the time in the late 60s, during that style-mongering period, was in American modernism, actually from the 40s, the kind of container corporation style, American optimism after the war, and all of that. And then the other poster was done in 1979, and that was a larger poster that I had a printer who I did a lot of business with, and for the holidays, they wanted to give me a fruit basket or a bottle of champagne. I said, no, can you just print something for me when you have time? So I would make the mechanical and the film and the printer. All he had to do was print the thing. So I had this poster printed in 1979, as I said, and it's the transition from modernism to postmodernism. And I wanted to comment on that. So you see this guy there, the modernist grid, faithfully laying down the tile, and then this kind of fetish things comes through, and it says you as well as me. And the other kind of promotion that I got a chance to do experimental stuff on was studio promotion. So the studios would promote their illustrators. So the illustrators here were, so a designer would design a poster, and then an illustrator would do the illustration, and it would be printed. And so you could, like in this case, I designed a typeface that has little floating serifs. So it was another opportunity to do experimental work. And then I did also arts organizations. I was always willing to do, all they had to come up with was the money for printing, and I could get the type for them, and I could design the stuff for them. So I designed a lot of posters and things for photographers, for arts organizations at the time. And again, where I could literally do what I was interested in doing And basically that was about typography. And sometimes it was really great to work together with an artist. So there's a Stephen Goodfellow was a Detroit artist, did the top and I did the bottom, where the typography kind of mirrors the artwork. And the same here, that was a Kathy Brackett-Luke's artwork. And then the typography kind of plays off of her artwork. And there was the back of the thing. And these were other little pieces like that where the typography and the photography kind of play off of each other. And I could do these kinds of odd mixes and all sorts of things that you couldn't really do in commercial work as easily. Even Art Deco. I did something, benefit at the Fox Theater for the Focus Gallery in 1985, actually. And there again, I could use my kind of typography and kind of skew Art Deco or 20s typography. The cover gave it the context. So after 30 years, I finally, as Walter Reuther said, 30 and out for auto workers. That way a worker wouldn't be burnt out and another worker would have an opportunity. So I decided to take him up on that idea, and I did. So I retired from professional practice and car work and all of that. And decided to leave the bucks behind. And since I had done pretty well, I have to say, in 30 years, sent my kids to college, bought a house, consumed a lot of stuff. So I came to the Magic Kingdom, as Roy Slade called it, a magical place, Cranbrook, to do my 2 years of graduate work. But before that, I have to give a shout out to CCS. I didn't have a degree, an undergrad degree, so I went down to CCS a couple of years before I went to Cranbrook and said, I need an undergrad degree. And they said, oh, you know what? With your reputation, we'll give you a degree if you just take all the academic classes, and we'll waive all the credits for the design classes, since you're a 30-year veteran of design. So what can we teach you about design? But they taught me an awful lot about the academic subjects. So it was an amazing education that I have to say that I got at CCS with the Tisches and Bill Porter and a whole slew of people that taught the academic classes. There's the theory classes, the history classes, the philosophy classes. So it was an amazing education. And I realize now that without that CCS underpinning of theory and history or education, I don't think I could have done what I did do for the 2 years I was at Cranbrook. So that was an amazing thing for me to be able to do, especially at the age of being in my 40s. I really appreciated it, probably more than all the 20-year-olds down there who didn't have my kind of maturity to realize what they were getting. Anyway, thank you, CCS. And now, of course, I have an exhibition there, which if you don't know about it, you should go see at the Center Gallery. Okay, back to this thing. Now the back of this. And the back of this had all these typefaces that I designed when I was a student at Cranbrook, and also kind of my philosophy about keeping the irregularities inconsistent, variously differentiated, and otherwise unmatched in all manner of ways and variety of sorts. Indeed, I do. So. So the idea that this constant kind of irregularity. So even irregularity is regularity if it doesn't stay irregular. So anyway, it's fairly convoluted, but it's as convoluted as the work is going to be, as you'll see. Anyway, I began at Cranbrook at the first semester doing the lines, which was a kind of Cranbrook project, the lines posters from the DIA, poetry, and they were through George Tisch, who I think taught here, I can't remember. And so I did that series, and again, continued the kind of typography that I was doing, for the arts organizations before I came here, and while I was going to CCS. just to show you this kind of old-fashioned typography that I've since replaced with what came out of Cranbrook. And I started doing flyers for Cranbrook also for the, so this is a Cranbrook student project. It was the type history poster, and my typographer was the Victorian typographer Robert Thorne, and the fat face. And I did it like an ad. It kind of mirrors my ad background, or madman background, I guess. So there's image, headline, subhead, 3 columns of typography, and sign off. So it has the kind of structure of an advertising, and it goes back to my years of that. Because when I did come to Cranbrook, I wanted to reinvent myself, but I also wanted to reiterate myself through reinventing myself. And so here's some little close-ups of, what that entailed. And again, we had to paste everything down, and we did all sorts of typographic experiments. And so I started by taking really wonderful old typefaces or new typefaces that were beautifully done, and screwing them up by cutting serifs off here and there. So I turned Bembo into Bimbo and things like that, since typefaces all have names. And then I would take I would paste that down, and then I would put it in the stat camera and twist it slightly. So all had to be done by hand and set up in a photostat camera. And then I used it on the projects. So this was a book project. So you can see that kind of typography. And then this is what I call student shenanigans, where we would make posters. We print them in the print lab. They were just silkscreen posters, and they were commentaries on what we were talking about in the crit room. And there again, it was a chance to make a typeface, cut it up, rearrange it, twist it slightly. So there again, always this problem of art and design. Finger on identifying that needlesome art touch in the design pie. So that was and then the beauty of Cranbrook was 2D and 3D worked together in the same studio. So I did a typographic thing where I made a chair, the chair, typographic chair for kids. And then I added to my ad business background my interest and also my background of coming of age during the abstract expressionist art period. So I added this kind of expressivity and expressionist work and tried to put that into the typography and into the projects. So again, these were projects, student projects. You can see a close-up. We'd have to get a photostat, and then we'd have to color it. And then I also did stuff, we had everything by hand, so this was a huge poster, all lettered by hand, this wild kind of typography. Get some close-ups of it. And then my thesis project was a wall of pages that had the alphabet. There were 3 A's, 3 B's, 3 C's, and they were done in every possible kind of what I call the commercial art vernacular. So here are some of those forms for that project. And the idea was to bring this kind of low vernacular into the high culture of academic design or design itself, or high-end design. So these are all letter forms. And when it was all up in one piece, you saw it as an alphabet. And that was as I said, my thesis and my thesis statement. I didn't write very much except this one paragraph that had 2 sentences in it. And one is and again, there are these 2 extremes that you saw with the museum bumper sticker, that design is assigned sign. And, playing air art and blah, blah, blah. And art makes me nuts. And Donald Cuspit came and did a lecture when I was a student here on the the psychoanalytic pinnings of art, and the whole business about the Freudian business of artists. We all start as artists as children, and then most people grow out of it, but artists don't. So that's a kind of pathology, and so on and so forth. Anyway, when I came out of the lecture, I said to my fellow students, I said, "Wasn't that great?" And I said, "That's true. Art makes me nuts." So that became a kind of mantra. And that's also the kind of difference between art and design. Design is meaning, even if it's contested meaning. So it's great. These are great slogans for T-shirts. And also in my thesis, I'll show you in a minute, I also had a page of one-liners. Coming out of advertising, I was big on one-liners. And then this was my seminal piece at Cranbrook in my second year, was this it happened to be New Bodies, which was really serendipitous, but it was a whole new body of work using this kind of expressive, deconstructive typography. And these were little flyers for the Focus Gallery, which was another arts organization downtown. And so again, they had a front and a back, and I would use the idea of taking a typeface and then cutting the serifs off irregularly, and then twisting it slightly, and cutting it up. And anyway, I ended up doing about 150 of these flyers, after Cranbrook, and that's what I've really become known for. And again, as I explained, they were after the fact, so there'd be a stack of them if I had an exhibition, for example. And there they are, actually shown in 2008 in the Red Cat in California, which is our Cal Arts gallery. And I came again to Cranbrook in 2006 when Elliot was here. So I made a flyer, an after-the-fact flyer. And again, I used my Cranbrook history in it. There's my one-liners that were part of my thesis statement. Things like, it looks good, seems to mean. And these were all things we bandied about as students also in many cases. Here's the label project, which was the famous project that was done here for years, the McCoys did. And there are the variations of it, where you'd take a candy bar, you would be given a candy bar. Kathy would slide them across the conference table, so they were kind of random. So I got the Three Musketeers. So we used all the text from the label, from the candy bar, and then did variations of typography. And so it was a whole semester project. So it went through typography from design to art. This was the finale of it, and I did mine very visually. And then it went back to design again. So it was the kind of initiation project for the first semester, where you went from design to art and back again, which was really an amazing project because you kind of took everything apart and put it back together again. And photography. So we could take electives. I took an amazing elective from Gary Nodell's History of Fiber class that we met once a week, and it was the most incredible imagery I ever saw in the history of fiber. And I took Carl Toth's photocrit. So I took Polaroids and I drew on them or collaged on them. So this was my project. I called it Arty Polaroids for my Carl Toth elective. And I continued with Polaroids. And I also started when I was at Cranbrook on one of our field trips, taking the lettering pictures with Polaroid. So I started in '85, and these are the lettering pictures. Eventually, by 2000, it became a book called Letters on America. I did them for a full 15 years. There's the book is on the remainder table. But by the way, look who it's next to. So by 2004, it was already remaindered at the Strand. But now it's of course, you get on the internet like anything. So that book was the same idea. You know, I had a teaching job for all those years, and every summer I'd drive across the country to come back to the Midwest and the East Coast, and I would take these Polaroid pictures, and they eventually became a book. But what interested me, again, was not the whole sign, but the details. Like, even though that's a wonderful sign, it was those two, you know, communist G's in egg. So just to show you the pages of the book, my wife, Lucy Bates, edited the book. So she took the 3,000 pictures and turned it into about 1,700 pictures, which ended up being part of this book. So she made these arrangements, and they were all in the book. And so again, it shows lettering as it's being, as it exists in the world, and also as it looks photographed. So Polaroid went out of business, and so I've ended up with digital. And I just love digital photography and digital lettering photography. Because all my life I never could master a camera or a darkroom, and now you just put it on automatic and put it in iPhoto. And you can make the artiest pictures. And also, I can make lettering now in completely different ways that I could never have done with Polaroid. So you can look at, you know, lettering in the world in a very different way that digital allows. So I have thousands and thousands of digital pictures, but I've never printed a single one. They're all just on the computer. But it's beautiful what, I'm just so impressed by digital photography after years of analog Polaroid photography, where you kind of got what you got. And there, for you students who are into the latest global neo-modernist style, you can also find it in the vernacular. The other thing is the vernacular, is the history of graphic design. So this is from history. Wasn't exactly my history, but it's the history of our profession. And one of the most amazing histories in our profession is what's called sign painting or show card lettering, which existed from around the turn of the century until the early 50s. And this is from 1915, and the other one is 1918. But you can also see the kind of rich heritage that we graphic designers and typographers and letterers have from the past, and a past that isn't all that well known. So I've really worked with that past and loved, and here's another flyer, because I just love this old stuff. So this was for New Orleans. I did a lecture in New Orleans before the hurricane. So there's the front and the back. And so if you understand Victorian, I mean everyone, you understand how a Victorian poster works, or a circus poster, or a 19th century poster with this kind of type energy that they had. I used the same idea, except it was a typography that obviously didn't exist in the 19th century. So it has the same energy, it has the same look, and it plays with that, but it plays with it in a completely different way. So again, it's not historicism, it's a kind of what's now called postmodernism, obviously. And you know, I have alphabets. My fonts are all my little lettered alphabets, which again, as I say, started here at Cranbrook. So I had this one, and I you know, had a backslant and a italic version of it. So I would just paste that up to get that kind of energy. And then I even add the little tick marks and things like Victorian typography would have, which again is completely uncharacteristic of this kind of lettering. And also this kind of hand lettering is a font, so each letter is the same. So that, and then the back of it, again, uses history. I had a flood in my studio and a lot of things got wet, so I used those. And again, my apologies to New Orleans, because I just thought it was a damp place. Now, of course, after the flood, it was a tragedy. But this is that, and using that kind of history of Mississippi, the steamboats, you know, the smokestacks, and the kind of typography. So there's a great deal of attention paid to every little bit of typography on a flyer. Even the tiny little credit, you know, is carefully worked out in the style. So now we're getting to commercial art alphabet, not a font. This is that kind of commercial art vernacular that I really did so much work in the last 20 years. And again, this comes out of my thesis project at Cranbrook. And it has to do with connotation. You know, instead of denotation, there's an extreme of denotation. And it says, and the extreme of denotation, of course, is Helvetica. And this is the extreme of connotation, which is, of course, commercial art or commercial art lettering. Again, this was, oh yeah, by the way, this is, yeah, I paid my dues for Katrina because this was a fundraiser that some designers did for raising money for Katrina. So I did this flyer that they auctioned off copies of for fundraising for Katrina. Anyway, so you can see how wind, you know, is wind and fury, and, you know, water, scorned. And, you know, there's something almost kind of jokey about that kind of connotation, you know, that kind of commercial art connotation. So, and I always have been a little bit of a joker, I guess. And there, of course, is this idea also of a joker as a joker. You know, the total connotation of the letter forms being the image. And here's more examples of that, those kinds of things. And you can see, and again, using that same heritage that sign writers and show card letterers had. These are examples of this kind of stuff, done with Prismacolor pencil. This was for a cover. Some students in Poland asked me to do a cover for their magazine. And so I used the word Hamtramck. And they said, well, what is this Hamtramck? And I said, well, you know, Hamtramck was a huge Polish community in Detroit for many years. And so, you know, they explained that's the reference that it was on the cover of a Polish design magazine. And also for the 1999, the AIGA convention in Las Vegas, which of course is the ultimate kind of vernacular of lettering and signage. And I've used it for T-shirts, and this was a project for the Wolfsonian down in Florida on the Four Freedoms, where designers kind of reworked the Four Freedoms. And again, I'm using that kind of 40s lettering for the Four Freedoms piece. And also for commentary, which I love to do on the design profession. So a couple years ago, a book was published on asking all these designers, what is graphic design for? So this was my contribution to the book. And it's to make sugar-free candy for that eye, which is in the economy of the beholder. And that's a takeoff for, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And of course, it isn't in the eye of the beholder. It's in the culture, or even more so in the economy of the beholder. And this is also done in this kind of, you know, connotative, almost corny way of candy and eye and economy. Here's another example of it where it's a total contradiction. And these are other examples of that, using that kind of lettering in a more artful way. So it becomes art, becomes wordplay. And, you know, this is stuff that's, you know, shown in art galleries. And really taking the forms so it's not even readable anymore. And it almost becomes pure form. But it's still letter forms and you know, the forms of a lettering and decoration, all the sorts of forms that are part of commercial art and design. And, you know, it doesn't even have to have a letter in it, and it still kind of looks that way. So another flyer I did when I did a lecture at the Walker, and Andy Blauvelt was the curator at the Walker, was a classmate of mine at Cranbrook in the 80s. And so I made the entire flyer. It was great also for me in my Cranbrook style. So it was Cranbrook nostalgia. So everything in the flyer is done with bits of Cranbrook stuff that I did as a student, you know, 20 some years before. And by the way, this is the indicia. All these flyers have a panel on the back, the bottom third, where the return address, the address block, and the stamp goes here. And so again, using all my twisty, turning kind of type stuff from Cranbrook. This time it was easier to do because I just did it on a Xerox machine. And then the back had a sketchbook page. And that was another thing that I really came, that became a really important part of my education here was these sketchbooks that I had on my desk, and every day I would do several pages that had to do with the thinking that we were doing, and also just pages. Sometimes they had to do with the project. You can see this is part of that type history poster, and other kinds of projects. And mostly it was just a pure exploration of form. That's a kind of a rubbing of the previous page, putting together drawing, collage. I did 4 or 5 books that they each had about 90 to 100 pages in them in my 2 years here. But it was really rich kind of exploration of forms. So this is from my books that I did while I was here. And I did my first, the last day I was here, I finished up my book, and I thought, now I'm going to be on the road. I'm going to California for a teaching job. How the hell am I going to do these things? Because I don't have all my colored pencils. And so I decided I'd get one of those 4-color ballpoint pens, those Bic pens. So I started my 4-color sketchbooks. They were a little smaller, so I could carry them in my pocket. And so I've done thousands of pages of these 4-color ballpoint sketchbooks. So here are the sketchbooks. As I said, there's 130. I'm working on 131 or 2 at the moment. I counted them a couple years ago, so I know how many there are. And they really range from, well, here's a page, so it's always on one side of the page, basically. And they're really not sketches for anything, but they have the same kind of spontaneity and intuitiveness that sketches have or sketchbooks have. So they're a kind of designer sketchbook. And they range through the whole history of design. So here you can see, medieval kind of stuff, or initial cap. Here's a fascist poster and a Bolshevik poster. Here's some Polish circus posters. Of course, completely fake and not even anywhere near. They just kind of have a trace of history in them. So there's just, I counted, I think there's over 10,000 pages I have now in those books. So I'm in the process of scanning them all. So I have 20 more books to scan, so I'm doing pretty good. Since it takes a week or so to scan a book. And again, these are ballpoint pens. It's a kind of deconstruction of commercial art. And it's also the fact that I retired after 30 years of doing this stuff every day, so I wanted to continue doing it, so I still do it every day. So it's like a machine, a widget machine, that makes widgets, and it doesn't have a blueprint anymore, so it's still making widgets, but it doesn't make widgets for any particular reason. So, but it's still running strong. So that's kind of what these books are. And a lot of them are collage also. And I've always used collage, as you saw from the Cranbrook period. That was a part of it. And collage. And also collage allows you to have all sorts of compositional experiments. So finally, at last, what do I do now as a retired exit level everything? So I have 2 projects. One is, by the way, even though I retired from education, I could still keep my little studio at Cal Arts as a kind of honorary professor emeritus. So this is the sign of my studio. So what I do is, my studio is potential graphic design for bygone eras. So that's what I do. And wait a minute. Oops. There's my little studio. It's just a little 10 by, whoops, sorry. 10 by 10, 10 by 16 little room, has all my stuff in it. And that's where I make all this work. So here's the bygone era stuff. So think about like a 16th century page, done in a more avant-garde way, 21st century way, or 20th century way, 18th century, Penny Dreadful, surrealist ball invitation, 50s, 60s, 70s, Art Deco, of course, can't leave that out. And the other project is, I'm going back to that first photo you saw when I became a commercial artist at 18. So here I am, even though I got a scholarship when I was in high school to go to art school. And I wanted to go to New York or Los Angeles, but the scholarship I got was for Indianapolis. So I thought, I don't want to go to art school in Indianapolis. I'm from Detroit. I want to go to a bigger city, not a smaller one. And you got to remember, in those days, Detroit was the 5th largest city in America, and a really booming place. And the idea of going to a smaller city, everyone went to New York or the East Coast or Chicago. Anyway, I didn't take the scholarship, so I didn't become an artist. Otherwise, I would have been an abstract expressionist painter, no doubt. And I really like that idea also, that I didn't become a painter. I would have been a failed painter probably anyway. And that's that old cliche about a failed painter becomes a commercial artist. So there's and I'm a good example of that. So as a successful commercial artist, now I can look back on my failed painting career. But I don't really have one. So this is the kind of painting I did do, back in the late 50s, 1960. So now I make drawings for paintings. So this is my alternative or my counterfactual history. So I pretend I went to art school and I became a painter. And so I've got hundreds of these drawings for paintings. And actually when you scan them and put them on the computer, they actually look like paintings, or if they're reproduced. So there they are, my abstract expressionist failed paintings. And I love doing them, and they come really natural because I never did have an art career. So it just goes right back to, my maturity during that period. And, they're pretty, actually. And there. The thing to do with them, and I do with them, is put them on my blogs. I love blogs. I love the internet. I love the whole idea that you can blog. And, it's a ripple effect. People reblog, and it gets endlessly reblogged. So I have 2 blogs, a Pinterest blog, which is that fella yesterday. And then I have a photo blog, because I'm so excited that I can be a fancy photographer now. And there's Moholy-Nagy, Bauhaus, a statement about the illiterate of the future will be the person ignorant of the use of the camera as well as the pen. I changed the word person. He said man. But that was 1928. So there's my Tumblr, my photo blog. And that's exactly what my photos are. Form, follies, fancy. And, of course, I have a website, although I haven't done much work on it. And we have a granddaughter. So that's it. If you want to know who I am, I just answered the question. And I finally solved that face problem. So I got my face into it. And my name has a face. So now you can ask questions if there's time. Or if not, we can mill around. Thank you.